The boomers didn't kill the American dream. They just happened to be standing in the room when someone changed all the rules and then everyone blamed them for not stopping it. Here's what actually happened. And once you see the mechanics, you'll understand why pointing fingers at an entire generation misses the real story. Because the truth is, most boomers got played by the same system that's squeezing everyone else today. They just had a head start before the trap closed. Think of the American dream like a house, not a metaphor, an actual house. In 1946, after World War II, my parents' generation came home and found the government had essentially pre-approved them for a mortgage. The GI Bill wasn't charity. It was a calculated move. You had 12 million veterans who needed something to do that wasn't revolution or unemployment. So the government said, here's a loan at 3%, go buy a house in the suburbs. And they did, millions of them. My dad bought his first house in 1952 for $11,000. His salary as a factory foreman was $4,000 a year. That's a house-to-income ratio of about 2.75 to 1. Keep that number in your head. Now, I need to tell you about my neighbor growing up, a guy named Frank. Frank worked at the Ford plant, came home every day at 4:15, mowed his lawn on Saturdays, and owned his house outright by the time he was 43. One income, 3 kids. A wife who didn't work outside the home not because of some ideology, but because they didn't need the money. The system worked like this. You showed up, you did the work, and the math added up. The house was achievable. That's not nostalgia, that's arithmetic. But here's where it gets interesting. That house, that system, was built on a very specific set of conditions that most people at the time thought were just normal. They weren't normal. They were a historical accident. First, every other industrial economy on the planet was literally bombed into rubble. Europe was rebuilding. Japan was rebuilding. America was the only factory still standing, so American manufacturing had essentially zero competition. If you wanted a car, a refrigerator, a toaster, it was probably made in America by an American worker. That created massive demand for American labor, which meant wages went up. Second, the top marginal tax rate in 1955 was 91%. Now, before you start yelling, nobody actually paid 91%. But that rate did something important. It meant corporations couldn't just extract profit and hand it to shareholders. So instead, they invested in workers, in pensions, in infrastructure. They built things because building things was more tax efficient than hoarding cash. Third, unions were strong. In 1955, about 35% of American workers were unionized. Again, not making a political point here, just stating the mechanics. When a third of workers have collective bargaining power, wages across the entire economy get pulled up. It's just physics. So you had high demand for American labor, tax structures that encouraged long-term investment over short-term extraction, and unions strong enough to negotiate a cut. That's the foundation the house was built on. And for about 25 years, it worked. I was born in 1954. I grew up thinking this was just how the world worked. You graduated high school, maybe you went to college. If not, you got a union job, you bought a house, you retired with a pension. The end. I watched my dad do it. I watched Frank next door do it. It seemed automatic. Here's the first place I saw the cracks. 1973. I'm 19 years old, working at a gas station while going to community college. And one day in October, the line of cars waiting for gas is suddenly wrapped around the block. OPEC had just cut oil exports to the US because of the Yom Kippur War, and overnight, gas prices quadrupled. People were furious. I had a guy scream at me for 20 minutes because I wouldn't let him cut in line, like I controlled Saudi oil policy. But the gas crisis wasn't really about gas. It was the first time America realized the system could break, that the house could have a crack in the foundation. And then the cracks started showing up everywhere. Vietnam was an expensive disaster. Nixon resigned in 1974, and the economy started doing something economists said was impossible: stagflation. Prices going up, jobs disappearing, growth stalling, all at once. By 1980, inflation hit 13.5%. The prime rate, the rate banks charged their best customers, hit 21.5%. You couldn't buy a house because even if you qualified for a mortgage, the interest would eat you alive. I knew people in their 30s still renting because homeownership was literally mathematically impossible. The house was still there, but now it had a moat around it, and the moat was filled with interest rates. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but that was just a rough patch. Things got better. And you'd be right, sort of, because what happened next is where the story really turns. 1980, Ronald Reagan gets elected, and Reagan comes in with a completely different philosophy about how the house should work. He said, and I'm paraphrasing but not by much, the problem isn't the house. The problem is the government is standing in the way of the house. Get government out of the way, let the free market work, and everyone wins. And here's the thing. At the time, after a decade of chaos, that message felt right. It felt like common sense. I voted for Reagan twice. I'm not apologizing for it. I'm just telling you the psychological state we were in. We were exhausted. We wanted someone to say it's going to be okay. We have a plan. So Reagan cut taxes. The top rate went from 70% to 28% by the time he left office. He deregulated industries. He broke the Air Traffic Controllers Union in 1981, which sent a signal to every corporation in America that the union era was over. And the Federal Reserve, under Paul Volcker, jacked interest rates up to 20% to kill inflation. It worked, kind of. By 1983, inflation was falling. The stock market started climbing, unemployment dropped. On paper, things looked better. But here's what was happening underneath. The foundation of the house was being quietly replaced. Remember those three conditions? Competition, tax structure, unions. All three were being systematically dismantled. Companies started moving manufacturing overseas because why pay an American worker $20 an hour when you can pay a worker in Mexico $3 an hour? The tax cuts meant corporations could now extract profit, send it to shareholders, and get rewarded for it. And with unions broken, workers lost the leverage to negotiate for their share of productivity gains. Here's a concrete example. In 1978, a CEO made about 30 times what their average worker made. By 1995, it was 123 times. By 2000, it was 383 times. The money was still being generated. It just wasn't flowing to the workers anymore. It was flowing up. But here's the really clever part, the part that made this whole thing politically sustainable. Instead of raising wages, the system offered something else, credit. If you can't afford the house with your salary, here's a credit card. Here's a home equity line of credit. Here's an adjustable rate mortgage. The house was getting more expensive, but they were giving you a longer ladder. You just didn't notice the ladder was made of debt. I want to tell you about my cousin Rick. Rick graduated high school in 1985, worked in construction, did everything right. In 1992, he bought a house in Phoenix for $130,000. His salary was about $38,000 a year. That's a ratio of about 3.4 to 1. Already worse than my dad's generation, but still manageable. By 2005, that same house was worth $420,000. Rick thought he was rich. He took out a home equity loan, bought a truck, took the family to Disneyland. Everyone was doing it. The banks were handing out these loans like candy. Why? Because they weren't holding the loans anymore. They were bundling them, slicing them up, and selling them to investors as mortgage-backed securities. The risk was distributed, which meant nobody had an incentive to be careful. Then 2008 happened. The housing market collapsed. Rick's house dropped to $260,000. He owed $390,000 on it. He was underwater. He lost the house in 2009. The bank got it back. He's renting now. He's 60 years old and he's renting. Now, here's where people say, see, boomers. They got greedy, they took out loans they couldn't afford, they caused the crash. And look, sure, individual decisions matter. But zoom out. Rick didn't invent mortgage-backed securities. He didn't repeal Glass-Steagall in 1999, the law that had kept commercial banks and investment banks separate since the Great Depression. He didn't design a system where banks profited from originating bad loans because they immediately sold the risk to someone else. Rick was operating inside a system that was designed at every level to encourage maximum debt extraction. And when it collapsed, the government bailed out the banks and left people like Rick holding the bag. Let me give you the numbers. In 2008, the government spent $700 billion on the bank bailout. The Fed added another 7.7 trillion in secret loans to financial institutions that we only found out about years later because of a Bloomberg lawsuit. Meanwhile, about 10 million people lost their homes. The boomers in their 50s and 60s watched their 401ks get cut in half. A lot of them had to delay retirement. Some never got to retire at all. So here's escalation number one, and it's the one nobody talks about. Boomers didn't kill the American dream. They were the generation that lived through its dismantling, and most of them didn't have the tools to understand what was happening because it was happening slowly, policy by policy, over 40 years. Escalation number two is even weirder. The boomers who did benefit from all of this, the ones who actually got rich, they weren't the majority. They were a small slice at the top. But because the media loves a simple story, that slice became the face of the generation. You know the image? The rich boomer with 3 houses complaining about avocado toast, telling millennials to just work harder. But here's the reality. The median net worth of a boomer in 2019, right before the pandemic, was about $206,000. That sounds like a lot until you realize most of that is tied up in home equity. They don't have $200,000 in cash. They have a house that's worth more than they paid for it, but if they sell it, they still need somewhere to live, and housing is expensive everywhere now. Meanwhile, about 45% of boomers have zero retirement savings outside of Social Security. Zero. They're terrified. They're working past 70, not because they love their jobs, but because they can't afford to stop. So who actually won here? Follow the money. In 1989, the top 1% of Americans owned about 30% of the wealth. By 2019, they owned about 32%. Doesn't sound like much, right? But here's the thing. The total wealth of the country doubled in that time. So the 1% didn't just keep their share, they kept their share of a much bigger pie. In absolute terms, they vacuumed up trillions. And it wasn't boomers as a generation, it was a class that spanned generations. The people who owned capital, who owned assets, who had access to the right tax strategies and the right financial instruments. Plenty of Gen X and millennials in that club too. Escalation number 3 is about the psychological warfare, because that's really what this was. The entire shift from wage-based prosperity to debt-based consumption required a change in how people thought about themselves. In the 50s and 60s, the story was, you're a worker, you contribute, you get a share. By the 80s, the story became, you're a consumer, the market will provide, just keep spending. And if you can't afford it, that's a personal failure. You didn't work hard enough, you made bad choices. This is where the whole avocado toast thing comes from. It's not really about the toast. It's about shifting blame from a system that stopped delivering to individuals who supposedly aren't trying hard enough. And a lot of boomers bought into that story because, again, they lived through the transition. They saw the system work for their parents, then saw it stop working, and the explanation they got was, well, people today are just softer. They want participation trophies. They don't want to work. I hear this stuff at barbecues, I hear it from guys I grew up with, and I want to grab them and say, look at the numbers. A house in 1952 was 2.7 times annual income. A house in 2020 was 7 times annual income. College tuition at a public university in 1980 cost about $900 a year. In 2020, it was over $11,000. Adjusted for inflation, that's an increase of about 160%. Meanwhile, wages adjusted for inflation have been basically flat since 1973. This isn't about work ethic, it's about math. The house got more expensive and the ladder got shorter. Escalation number 4 is what's happening right now in 2026. Boomers are aging out of the workforce. About 10,000 boomers turn 65 every single day. And a huge chunk of them are financially fragile. They can't retire, but employers don't want them because they're expensive and old. So they get pushed out and then they end up in this weird limbo where they're too old to get hired and too young for full Social Security benefits if they haven't hit their full retirement age yet. And here's the kicker. Because boomers are such a large generation, when they downsize or die, they're going to flood the housing market with inventory. Some economists think this could finally ease the housing crisis. Others think it's going to crash home values, which would be great for buyers but catastrophic for boomers who were counting on selling their house to fund retirement. Either way, the generation is about to become an economic variable, not economic actors. So let's get concrete with a case study. I'm going to tell you about a guy named Tom. Tom's real. I changed his name, but everything else is accurate. Tom's 67. He worked at a mid-sized manufacturing company for 38 years. Started on the floor, worked his way up to plant supervisor. Good job. Solid middle-class life. In 2002, his company announced they were switching from a traditional pension to a 401k match. They said it was about giving employees more control over their retirement. What it really was about was getting liabilities off the corporate balance sheet. A pension is a promise the company has to keep. A 401k is your problem. Tom rolled his pension into the 401k. In 2008, he lost 41% of it when the market crashed. He was 50 years old. He didn't have time to recover. He kept working. Then in 2016, the company got bought by a private equity firm. They immediately cut the 401k match from 6% to 3%. In 2018, they laid off half the supervisors, Tom included, and hired contractors at lower wages. Tom's now working part-time at a hardware store making $16 an hour. He was making salary equivalent to about $42 an hour before. His 401k has about $93,000 in it. His house is paid off, worth about $280,000. His Social Security will be about $2,200 a month. He's gonna be okay, barely, if nothing goes wrong. One medical emergency, and he's wiped out. Tom didn't kill the American dream. Tom was promised a deal, he kept his end, and the other side changed the terms halfway through. Now, 2 quick cutaways here, because I need you to understand how absurd some of the discourse has gotten. Cutaway 1. I saw a headline last year that said, "Millennials, stop blaming boomers for your problems." The writer's argument was that boomers pay taxes their whole lives and young people today just want free stuff. I wanted to reach through the screen and ask, do you not understand how debt works? The national debt tripled under Reagan, doubled under George W. Bush, and went up another 30% under Trump. Boomers voted for tax cuts and wars and then handed the bill to the next generation. That's not free stuff, that's a credit card binge. Cutaway 2. I was at a city council meeting last year where they were debating a zoning change to allow more multifamily housing. A guy, probably 70, gets up and says, "I bought my house in 1974, and if you let them build apartments here, it'll ruin my property value." I wanted to ask, "Sir, do you understand that you are the problem? Your house appreciated 900% because we stopped building housing. Your retirement is subsidized by the next generation not being able to afford homes. That's not prosperity, that's a Ponzi scheme." So here's where we land. The American dream didn't die because of a generation. It died because of a series of deliberate policy choices made by a small group of people, mostly elites, over 4 decades. Deregulation, tax cuts for the wealthy, union busting, financialization, wage stagnation, debt expansion. Each one was sold as common sense, as freedom, as growth, and each one transferred wealth and security from labor to capital. Boomers were there for it. Some of them cheered it on because they believed the story. Some of them were too busy working to notice. Some of them got rich off it. But the vast majority of them are in the same boat as everyone else now, just further along in the journey, looking at a retirement that doesn't exist and wondering what the hell happened. So what do you do with this information? I'm going to give you 3 takeaways that aren't generic. 1. Stop fighting generational warfare. It's designed to distract you. When you're yelling at boomers, you're not looking at the people who actually designed this system. The billionaires, the lobbyists, the politicians on both sides who've been serving capital instead of labor for 50 years. Generational conflict is a psyop. Don't fall for it. 2. Understand the incentives. Every policy, every economic shift, every cultural change, ask yourself, who benefits? When they repealed Glass-Steagall, banks benefited. When they cut taxes on the wealthy benefited. When they pushed 401ks instead of pensions, corporations benefited. Once you see the incentives, the pattern becomes obvious. 3. The house can be rebuilt, but not with the old blueprint. You can't go back to 1955. That world is gone. But you can design a new version where housing is affordable, education doesn't require debt slavery, healthcare doesn't bankrupt you, and work actually pays enough to live on. It requires policy. It requires political will. It requires enough people to stop blaming each other and start looking up at the people running the system. The American dream didn't die. It got repoed. And most boomers were just renters like everyone else.